Hi, welcome to session 8, and in this session we focus on designing equity focused and gender responsive evaluation. We've so far looked at uh, what equity focused evaluation is on gender responsive evaluation. We looked at overview of those tools and excuse me. Um, and then we looked at planning for equity focused and gender responsive evaluation. We later on looked at uh, preparation for equity and gender responsive evaluation. And so now we look at and then we also looked at some of the theories related to gender responsive and equity focused evaluation. And so now we take a look at uh, how we can design evaluations that are equity focused and gender responsive. So we look at briefly again talk about selecting evaluation theory that are related to equity focused evaluation. We look at selecting selection of appropriate evaluation framework that captures interests of the worst of groups and the marginalized or vulnerable groups, and then look at selecting appropriate designs for effective equity focused or gender responsive evaluation. So, like I said earlier, we already looked at planning, we looked at preparation, and now we look at designing equity focused and gender responsive evaluation. So first things is that we select evaluation theory or theoretical frameworks within which we can fit our evaluation, and there are many theoretical frameworks, designs, and tools that where we can fit equity focused or gender responsive evaluation. But of course, selection will depend on the purpose of evaluation, for which now we want to focus on whether, for instance, the different groups of beneficiaries or communities have been equally realizing or experiencing the impacts of the evaluation or scope of evaluation, whether we want to take it to different groups of individuals within communities, or whether we want to focus on men and women or a particular intervention focus. Uh, and of course, also depends on the evaluation questions or nature and context of the intervention to be evaluated. So choosing again evaluation mode or theory, again variety of evaluation models or theoretical frameworks that value stakeholder participation, but of course depending on the purpose of evaluation and their differences depend on their recommendations on why and how different stakeholders, including marginalized groups, should be involved. And of course, you have the traditional uh, or conventional models or theoretical frameworks that would look at just mere evaluation, but also those differ from the complex based or developmental evaluation models, or those other models that look at maybe are based on constructivist or interpretive kind of evaluation. So again, variety. So we looked at all these in the previous session, on session 7, regarding the different theories that relate to equity focused evaluation. And you have developmental models, those that look at evaluation that looks at making changes as evaluation takes place, or as the implementation of a particular project or program takes place. And there is also utilization focused evaluation that looks at how the evaluation results will be used, and in this case by different groups of stakeholders. You also have system thinking theory that applies to assessing or unpacking the different complexities of a particular intervention, to see how different outcomes are influenced, or the different factors that influence different outcomes, whether intended or unintended. And then you also have the real world evaluation model that focuses on questioning how interventions could be evaluated, uh, considering that there are limitations that relate to political factors, budgets, and social factors, and other factors that would limit or determine the effectiveness of evaluation. And then you also have participatory or collaborative theoretical framework or theories that look at the different modes of involving stakeholders within the intervention, just from the beginning, from designing up to the evaluation or closure of the intervention. So you could look at details of these explanations in the previous session. But we say that regardless of the framework, the selection or choice of the theory or framework would depend on the participation that is open, transparent, and impartial, and therefore, in this case, regarding participation of every individual, regardless of their race or religion or sex or gender or anything. So just refer to the previous section on gender analysis and intersectionality for that purpose. The choice also of the framework or in theory or model also consider we put into considerations of participation that reflects the diversity of different stakeholders within communities, whether old or young, or women or men, or girls or boys, or people with disability, and so on. Also considering the degree of participation and why it is important, is appropriate for each evaluation stage. For instance, do we need to involve women during designing, or we only involve them during collection of data, during focus group discussion, in that case? Then also considering the competency of the evaluation team, uh, whether it has strong skills regarding uh, how they are capable of conducting an equity focused or gender responsive evaluation process. You could look for these details regarding ethical considerations and cultural competency of evaluation team in session 2 and session 6. So Bamberger and Segon give us two examples of evaluation frameworks that could apply to we could consider for also for equity focused evaluation, that would apply in our designs. So one of them is theory-based equity-focused evaluation, which also considers theory of change. We've been talking about theory of change over and over, but we can take a look at it from the gender responsive evaluation. And then the other one is bottleneck analysis framework. So the theory-based equity evaluation, focused evaluation looks at theory of change to try in understanding, for instance, theory of change would help in this case to understand the vulnerable group or marginalized group, and how they are impacted in different specific contexts. But also theory of change could help to describe the complex realities of equity-focused interventions. The fact that equity applies or may happen depending on the different realities or contexts within which the interventions are being implemented. Also, theory of change could also act as a tool for interpreting findings, since we already established how we want our outcomes to flow or results to our desired results to come or to appear. Then in this case, if we have theory of change at a later stage while we are evaluating, then we could keep referring to the theory of change to see whether what we had anticipated is being achieved or has been achieved in that case. So why theory of change for gender and equity focused evaluation? Of course, the theory of change can define the nature of the problem, because we already know from the beginning that if we have this problem, for instance, high incidence of malaria, then we need to distribute mosquito nets. So the theory of change can help us define the nature of the problem, but it can also identify causes and solutions depending on what we want to apply. It also describes the purpose of the intervention through the results chain, for instance, on how different results or as part of the solutions would help in solving the defined problem. But of course, also theory of change could describe the outcomes that will be achieved, but also helping us to describe the assumptions or factors that may affect the process of achieving equity focused evaluation, or assessing why the impacts or effects are not realized equitably by the different groups. But of course, also the theory of change can help us to establish hypotheses that we can later on test to see whether the equity focused or gender responsive or gender sensitive intervention has been able to achieve its goals effectively. So here Bamberger gives, of course, for instance, the logic model that would represent a theory of an equity focused intervention, and you could see that you have contextual factors affecting the accessibility of the accessibility of vulnerable groups. You have economic factors, you have policy environment within which the intervention is working or operating. You have the institutional operational context, for instance, organization within the organization, whether there are resources also, and then you have the physical environment within which the intervention is operating. So you have those would influence how we could design or how equitable issues can be addressed within our design, whether we should consider qualitative methods or mixed methods or quantitative methods alone. And then itself also, those factors would influence what kind of resources that can would be what kind of resources would be needed as inputs for an equitable and gender responsive evaluation or intervention. And then they would again influence equitable implementation of strategies to see that maybe the distribution of resources or distribution of, for instance, if the project is on cash transfers, cash transfer or social protection, in that case, then the contextual factors would determine. Contextual factors in this case would be, for instance, gender roles or responsibilities. So those would influence whether the distribution of, for instance, cash transfer should be directed to women or both at household level. And of course, those would influence what kind of outputs or outcomes and impacts that would be realized, and of course whether it would be sustainable at a later stage or not. So those, all these could be part of the theory based evaluation, theory based equity focused evaluation or gender responsive evaluation. But of course, again, the development of such theory is dependent on previous experiences with different interventions, or based on the literature review of literature review that is related to any project that has already been implemented before. So depending on success or failures of the previous interventions. But of course, it's not that the theory of change, while the theory of change is presented in a linear way or a logical way, it does not necessarily mean that it cannot be refined. For any equitable, remember what we said from the beginning, that for any intervention or equitable focused intervention or evaluation should be flexible. So in this case, the basic logic models could also be refined depending on the new information that is gotten, or depending on the changes that are made, or depending on the purpose or scope. If the changes are made in such context, then the refinements of such logic or theory of change could happen. And this could happen within the contextual framework. So therefore, looking at the different contexts that are changing because of changing within which the intervention is operating, or the process on how evaluation is being done, or the results chain in terms of output, outcomes, and impact on how those are changing or being realized. But of course, also on the trajectory of intended outcomes or results. So the model can be refined, or theory of change can be refined to fit the purpose or scope or other contextual factors that are being recognized or appreciated. The second is the bottleneck analysis framework, and the bottleneck looks at supply and demand analysis of the different factors that, for instance, influence access or use of public services or tools. And of course, it evaluates or assesses service delivery system. In this case, for instance, could be health system, or education, and so on. And the bottleneck analysis describes looks at the description analysis of determinants or factors of factors that determine access of public services or goods by, in this case, worst of groups or vulnerable groups, since we are looking at since we are focusing on gender sensitive or for equity focused evaluation. So that's why we are looking at worst of groups or vulnerable groups, and it can be used to identify or strengths or weaknesses of service delivery system in this case. And according to Bamberg and Segon, there are 4 components of bottleneck framework, and these involve evaluation or assessment of use of services by worst of groups, the supply side factors that determine that determine access or use of services or goods of a particular intervention, the demand side assessment of the demand side factors that influence the use and access of service by the beneficiaries of the intervention, but also the contextual factors. And here you go. So for instance, on under the use of services, assessment of use of services within an equity focused evaluation looks at the adequacy of utilization. For instance, the estimates of utilization in terms of percentages, may also sustainability of the usage, whether for instance, if for instance the intervention is on improving maternal health, antenatal, the use of antenatal healthcare services by introducing community outreach programs, then you could look at how that is sustainable depending on the service users. Also cost effectiveness depending on how much of the resources are needed to invest in such outreaches to bring services of antenatal care closer to the mothers within communities. Then you also have, of course, the demand factors such as knowledge attitudes regarding services, the distance, for instance, the mothers travel from their villages to the health facilities or the zones where such services are being given, or the cost of travel, the availability of transport, cost of services, time constraints or cultural constraints in this case. Then you have supply side that have to do with, for instance, in the case of in the case of a maternal or child health care intervention, budget allocations by the management, whether there's where the services are culturally acceptable, how sensitive are the staff to, for instance, men and women, then ownership of the program by worst of groups or marginalized groups, women taking charge or participating in such projects. Then you have contextual factors that have to do with economic or political or institutional or legal administration or environmental factors. All these, of course, influence how such services or goods or outputs of an intervention are being utilized by particular groups, especially women and other worst of groups. So when a framework has been determined, when a theory has been used to influence the kind of equity focused evaluation, and the frameworks have been identified and identified for the equity or focus or gender sensitive evaluation, then the team can now, or the team or management can now focus on selecting appropriate design, of which appropriate design would be used to create equity or focused data for equity or focused evaluation or gender sensitive or gender responsive evaluation. And the designs are very many, and they could focus on mixed methods design or equitable focused evaluation at policy level, or it could be equitable focused evaluation at project or program level. In that case, focusing on impacts evaluation, where impacts, where gender or equity can be integrated in such impact evaluation designs. And there are different sub designs, of course, under impact evaluation, which include a non-experimental, quasi-experimental, or randomized controlled trials, or otherwise known as RCTs. And then, of course, the design would also focus on attribution and contribution, but also looking at, for instance, issues of counterfactual to see whether particular worst of groups would, where would, for instance, how would they be if an intervention would never have been introduced in that case. So let's begin with mixed methods. So the designs for, again, for equitable focused evaluation or gender responsive evaluation could utilize either qualitative approach alone or quantitative approach alone, or mixed methods, where there is a combination of quantitative or qualitative. So in this case, mixed, of course, mixed methods approaches are appropriate and most important for ensuring equitable or gender sensitive evaluation, but of course making sure that at least there is the methods are inclusive and participatory in nature, making sure that all groups, including worst of or vulnerable, most vulnerable groups are included in the process of using qualitative or quantitative methods. So of course the methods, like I said, is most appropriate. So whereby strength of one approach can be used to counter the strength of another approach, or strength of one method, quantitative method, can be used to counter the weaknesses of the other quantitative method or quantitative method, or vice versa. So, of course, it's actually the comprehensiveness assessment of how gender responsible equitable focused evaluation is, equitable focused is the intervention. And again, mixed method looks at using different methods to capture variety of perspectives. If you could recall, in for instance, in our first session, when we were looking at development as contextual, and in the second session or third, we also looked at issues of where Martins mentions the idea of capturing variety of realities. So to be able to capture variety of realities, we need to utilize different methods, whether quantitative or qualitative, or mixed of both, to be able to capture these different realities of different worst of groups or vulnerable groups. Otherwise, if we used only questionnaire, in, for instance, it means we are capturing only, for instance, realities of the educated women or men, and therefore leaving out those that are not educated, therefore missing out the idea for, or the rationale for equity focused or gender responsive or gender sensitive evaluation. So mixed methods and designs, of course, refer to collecting, analyzing, or interpreting quantitative and qualitative data in a single study. So, but of course, we have different methods, as we shall look at them in a moment. So here is an illustration. So you have quantitative and qualitative this side. So you have for instance, at phase at point A, the design concentrates completely on quantitative design, but at B, yes, there is some element of qualitative, but the quantitative methods are dominating the session. I mean the process of data collection. And at C, the more we move towards G, the more we get oriented, or the more we get the more we get oriented to qualitative. And of course, the more we move from G towards A, the more we get oriented to quantitative. So therefore, if we want good mixed or effective mixed methods, then we think of D, because it's the middle ground for either qualitative or quantitative. So types of mixed methods designs, you have sequential, and in under sequential you for instance have you have a design where the evaluation team can begin with quantitative data collection analysis, and then followed by qualitative data analysis and correction analysis, or vice versa, where a team or evaluation team could begin with qualitative data collection analysis and then followed by quantitative. So that in a sequential way, and then interpretation can come later, or you begin with quantitative data collection analysis and then interpretation, and then you use the findings of quantitative to be able to do qualitative. So it depends on what the evaluation team wants, or depends on the nature of the problem or the nature of the intervention under investigation, under evaluation. Then you have parallel, where you do both qualitative and quantitative at the same time. And then you have mixed multiple level evaluation, where evaluation is conducted on various levels at the same time, of course. So you have your illustration, for instance, there for sequential qualitative dominant mixed methods, where you begin with qualitative with quantitative, you have quantitative household survey in project villages to estimate household or characteristics or ethnicity or agriculture and so on, and then followed by qualitative data collection using key informants, for instance, or focus group discussions, or also, and then you could have your qualitative data analysis using within or between case analysis or constant comparisons and so on. So there are different designs that you could do your sequential design, but keeping in mind that the whole idea is that we include in the process the worst of groups and vulnerable groups. So you also have here an example of parallel multi-level design. So you have, for instance, your school district. So the project is on within the schools, and then you have school district. You have sample of schools. You have sample of classes and teachers. You have sample of students, and you have sample of families. But on each sample, you could utilize different categories of evaluation, or different categories of methods to capture different kind of data from different samples that you have. So in the whole thing of this, the one of the reasons why we do mixed methods is triangulation. And triangulation is where we compare the information from different evaluators or different times or different methods to be able to verify the particular data that we've collected. And of course, the overall rationale is to overcome the biases and weaknesses of one category of respondents, or maybe men, if the project is on, for instance, mosquito nets, the use of mosquito nets if the project was aimed at distributing mosquito nets, and then we are evaluating and doing an equitable focused or gender responsive. In this case, we would not want only to rely on information from only men but also women, because these all have an influence or determine how or whether mosquito nets would be used in a household. Or the rationale would also be to overcome weaknesses of one method. Let's say, for instance, use of survey and quantitative would limit exploration or getting detailed information on, for instance, satisfaction of usage of mosquito nets also, or single observation or theory of studies that would have been used. So that's the purpose of triangulation. So you could see these are triangulation could be in form of cross-checking, team of evaluation, for instance, a team of evaluation which has different disciplines, or men and women, or insiders and outsiders, since we consider participation. Or it could be triangulation regarding various sources of information. It could be events or people, and people could also be men, women, or old or young. It could be also places, in village versus urban, and so on. Triangulation could also be in terms of tools, could be interviews or survey, or use of diagrams, or use of focus group discussions, or use of survey, and so on. So mixed methods involves all these categories, for the purpose of triangulation, of course, to have all that kind of data that can be trusted, or reliable, or valid, or dependable, or transferable. Okay. So, for instance, so you could do validation of findings through triangulation, and you could do, for instance, collect data for quantitative, and then later on you use a qualitative method to see whether what you got through quantitative data can be verified or confirmed through qualitative data collection methods, or analysis. Or you could do analyze qualitative data, and then you use quantitative data analysis to see, for instance, if there are, to estimate or check the relationships between the different variables that you got during qualitative data collection and analysis. And then that could be the whole purpose of for instance, doing equitable focused evaluation. So we already looked at mixed methods as part of the design, but also another design could be equitable focused evaluation at policy level, where you could, for instance, use systems thinking approaches to find out most effective ways to intervene for the worst of groups, or how, for instance, a policy can create impacts effectively for everyone, including the worst of groups. Or equity focused evaluation could be, if equity focused evaluation design could focus on, at policy level, could focus on unpacking complexities of policy intervention to look at the different factors or determinants that would determine whether a policy would affect or create impacts, better impacts for worst of groups, just as those that are not worse off. or you could also do policy gap analysis to assess the key policy priorities and target groups, so that you could verify or justify why particular policies are being implemented for particular groups, including all those stakeholders that are affected by the project or that would affect the project processes, policy processes, I mean, sorry. But we could also have equity focused evaluation at the project or program levels, where, for instance, we can mostly now focus on impact evaluation designs at project levels or program levels, and we have different designs, impact designs, including non-experimental designs or quasi-experimental designs or randomized control trials. So in with the non-experimental designs are of course the weakest, because they do not demonstrate, they do not effectively demonstrate causality of between the inputs and outputs of the project and the impact that, or outcomes that are realized. So of course it is less expensive compared to experimental designs, and the experimental designs, for instance, could be, think of your randomized controlled trials, the RCTs, that strongly demonstrate the causality. Of course, we in a moment we're going to look at the causal and attribution. And then you also have quasi-experimental, which are in the middle, a mix of non and pure experimental design. So all these are different categories of design that you can use to test, to check equitable focused or gender responsive or sensitive evaluation. So while measuring, just the way we do the usual measurement of impact, while doing equity focused evaluation, the impacts can be also verified across different groups to see whether those particular groups have experienced the impacts of the intervention differently or in a similar way. So the checking of impact, checking of groups whether they are experiencing impact could be done on different groups to see to check the similarities and differences in terms of realization of this particular intervention impact. Could be that, for instance, within a cash transfer intervention, it could be that you find that men are benefiting more or have realized are benefiting more, and therefore found somewhere above with the counterfactual line, or you could find that that women, while even if they are participating, even receiving the cash transfers, they are not realizing the same impact just as men. So you have, in that case, would the design would focus on checking attributions and contributions, because it could be that, for instance, yes, while there are cash transfers, there are other factors that are indeed influencing the impact that is being realized, in terms of, for instance, income levels, also at household level. The checking of counterfactual base focuses on assessing the situation or conditions which hypothetically may prevail for different individuals or groups or organizations where there are no uh, development intervention. So the counterfactual identifies what would have happened to different groups or individuals in the absence of the program. So there you have it. For instance, so this is the counterfactual we're talking about, and then this is the impact. So you have the time under here, and you have provided the intervention. So the counterfactual would be used to test or check what would have happened if there was no intervention. So in that case, you would need to control factors so that would be able to test where the attribution, or to be able to attribute the impact towards the intervention. But otherwise, if we do not control the factors, then it would be difficult to measure, to test the counterfactual, but also it would be difficult to measure whether whether cash transfers, for instance, are responsible for the changes realized by both men and women in a particular community. So of course there are challenges with the impact evaluation designs, issues to do with ethical, for instance, some interventions by their nature affect the whole population, such as national law and so on. So you have multiple treatments in that case. But you also have, of course, if we are to consider ethical issues, we could look at whether men and women were able uh, uh, to realize or to participate in within the control and experiment groups. Then you have the small size regarding impact. Usually, for instance, if you consider randomized control trials, there are some that benefit, other groups do not benefit. And then you have the spillover program impacts to comparison groups that were not intentionally intended to benefit from, to benefit from the groups. And then you have, of course, non-compliances. Some treatments may, or some participants may not want to participate, or may not participate because of other factors, contextual factors. For instance, you want women to participate in a particular intervention, let's say group formation and within communities, or participate in access to legal services, but may not participate, not because of their unwillingness, or but because of the contextual factors such as cultural factors, or their men do not want them to participate. So all those are issues that you could consider if you are doing a equity focused based or gender sensitive evaluation. And of course, you could also look at attrition, where you have dropouts in both groups. Of course, in both groups, treatment and experiment group, because of people maybe have moved, or can't be found, or refuse to respond, or there could be fatalities, that some others have died also. Okay. So there are key elements of an appropriate gender sensitive or equity focused evaluation designs. So while you're trying to select or choosing an appropriate design, you could think of issues of using mixed methods, whether the methods that are being used to collect data or being used in the evaluation are mixed. We've already talked about the importance or significance of using mixed methods. Key elements, appropriate designs in this case could also consider stakeholder participation, inclusion of the most vulnerable groups, adequate resources to make sure that there is effective equity focused evaluation, adequate sample size for different groups, men, women, young children, or data desegregation, in this case collecting data for specific groups, not rather than generalizing, triangulation, taking advantage of the existing data for on different groups, but also validation of findings, as just we've looked at it a moment ago. So again, UN Women 2015 and Sharon 2014 also state that the key elements should also appreciate the designs, should also appreciate and emphasize use of mixed methods, should relate to both men and women, and should be inclusive, therefore considering participation of men and women, could aid also collection of sex desegregated data, consider limitations of informants. For instance, women could be willing to participate in the evaluation, but because of different conditions they cannot participate. So in this case, the design should make sure that it caters for such contexts and limitations. Acknowledgement and exploring gender roles, because for instance gender roles or responsibilities could be part of those limitations that could challenge participation of men and women, or realization of different benefits or outcomes of a particular intervention. And then also contextual or cultural sensitivity, so the design should be culturally sensitive in this case, and of course also bringing gendered lens into collection of data by the evaluation team. So when the proposed gender sensitive of equity focused evaluation design is assessed and it is found feasible, then data can be collected and analyzed for that particular equity focused evaluation. But of course, the feasibility can check whether data can be collected or whether it can be collected within the limitations or bounded time and resources, whether the designs address evaluation questions, equitable evaluation questions, or gender responsive evaluation questions, or whether the evidence can be considered credible by different key stakeholders. You could evaluators could focus on collecting data on only men when men's versions or perceptions are different from those of women. So in this case, such feasibility or analysis should also be done to make sure that such mistakes or risks won't be made during data collection and so on. So if all the feasibility checks are positive, then data could be collected. So the bottom line is that there are a variety of gender responsive or equity focused evaluation frameworks, and there are a variety of designs, but of course all these depend on the purpose and the scope of the evaluation for which the intervention is being implemented or also. And of course you have your several readings there that you could utilize for more detailed information. And thank you.